Thanks for waking up with us.
How you doing, everybody? Welcome back to Staying Focused for Jesus. Hope each and every one of you are having a blessed day in the Lord Jesus Christ as always. Today is Saturday, May 20th, 2023. Saturday, May 20th, 2023. The time is currently 2:45. This is part, let me see. What part is this? Because I'm finna upload. This is part 4. Part 4, if I'm not mistaken, because I gotta upload part 3. Yeah, part 4. I was talking to a sister in Christ about these things. She studied this a long time ago. Her pastor at the time, he put her up on game. But at the time, she would tell me that they believed that they were the people. They were the people. And then she came to find out that we are the people. And I remember this, just to show y'all this and make this point. You had the coronation of the so-called Prince Charles III, right? Now remember in the previous sermons, we spoke about the coronation throne or coronation chair and the stone of destiny, These people, most of them, they are imposters. I don't know if this is the real stone of destiny or not. It could or could not be. Let's see if we can get some more images. Let's see. Yeah, I think you kind of like see it right there. Now, before we get deep into this study, I want to make sure I tell you this. Really, really pay attention to what I'm about to say. Don't get thrown off by all these different stories and these different accounts. That's life. Even when you're studying, let's say like the Nephilim and stuff like that, you come across different stories, different accounts, but you allow yourself to be led by the Spirit to get the truth. Because obviously we've already seen stuff that is contradictory. We're going to see more stuff that seems to be contradictory. But at the end of the day, we are allowing ourselves, our spirit, to be guided and led by the Spirit of truth. As the word tells us, Christ is going to give us His Spirit, and His Spirit would what? Would guide us and lead us in all truth. Would guide us and lead us in all truth. Do we understand that? Okay. We're going to be dealing with this book right here, America and Britain. We're going to do chapter 9, 10, 11, and 12, if I'm not mistaken. And depending on how long the video gets, we'll stop it there, because this is going to give us some historical reference. This is also going to show us the Bible speaks about Jeremiah, the two daughters, not Jeremiah's daughters, but the two daughters of two queens being taken over to what we call Ireland, Scotland, for Bible prophecy to be fulfilled. We're finna get a whole nother level of evidence. With that being said, let's go ahead and get into it. We're going to read it. It's going to read to us, and then we're going to pause it and give a little bit of commentary. So let me bag up and let's go.
History demonstrates that the Israelite tribe of Dan played a key role in the establishment of the birthright tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh in their new homelands in the British Isles. As we will see, seafaring Danites established colonies in the Isles long before Israel's fall to the Assyrians, thus paving the way for later migrating Israelites to follow.
And I mentioned this to you before in some old sermons, how the Danites, they traveled over to what we call Ireland, Scotland, these different areas. They were seafaring. There are many scriptures. They're going to talk about it. And that's why I was telling you, when you saw these different groups over here, it's different groups of people. Some of them are Danites. Some of them are Egyptians, Phoenicians. You even had a small number, people wouldn't tell you this, a small number of Japhites over there. Now, when they were over there, a person can argue that, but they were over there. Some of them did go over there. Gentiles have always been in our mix. The Bible tells you that in the Old Testament. But they weren't in the numbers like people make it seem they were. When you had all these different groups, these different nations, these different tribes, should say tribes more specifically, over here, they were fighting amongst each other. And not only were they fighting amongst each other, we know how we get down. We mix among each other. We see that. We see the Egyptians mixing with the Israelites mixing with, other tribes and stuff like that, other tribes within Israel. And that's what you're seeing. This is the story right here.
As we will see, seafaring Danites established. Moreover, the Danites' proclivity for leaving waymarks, wherein they would rename various geographical areas based on their tribal name, Dan, has proven useful in identifying areas relevant to lost Israel's migrations. In its article on Celtiberia, referring to the Celtic colonization of Iberia, modern Spain and Portugal, the Encyclopedia Americana informs us that Celtic migrations occurred as early as 1000 BC and as late as 600 BC. Both time frames accurately reflect biblical history. It was during the golden age of Solomon's rule, about 970 to 930 BC, when Danite and Phoenician ships widely explored the Mediterranean, colonizing areas such as Iberia and beyond. Centuries later, Danites fled Palestine on ships just prior to the fall of Samaria, probably around 726 BC, no doubt seeking refuge at one of their pre-established trading posts or colonies. This sudden and sizable influx of fleeing Israelites bearing Proto-Celtic traits would not have gone unnoticed in Iberian history. As the children of Israel began to claim their tribal inheritances, the tribe of Dan was given a rather modest coastal lot west of Jerusalem spanning from Gaza to Joppa. Proving too small for the tribe, a contingent of Danites set out to claim an additional area along the northern fringes of Israel, near Mount Hermon. The key city they took was Laish, which they renamed Dan in honor of their father, Joshua 19 verse 47, Judges 18. Thus, the tribe of Dan was divided geographically between their main homeland on the Mediterranean coast and a landlocked area in the north. As indicated by Judges 5 verse 17, Dan had a strong seafaring heritage. In this particular passage, the Danites are criticized for being away at sea during a protracted local crisis. Two other biblical passages show that Israel as a whole, and no doubt the Danites in particular, benefited greatly from a close relationship with the peoples of Phoenicia, who were renowned for their maritime exploits.
Remember, Europe is named after Europa, a Phoenician princess. And when you go read the scriptures, there was stuff going on with Israel. I think there was at war, if I'm not mistaken. And Dan didn't come help. Dan didn't come help with his ships. Dan, pretty much stayed out the mix. And, God didn't like that too much. We're going to keep it simple.
As Israel began to settle the Promised Land, Egypt was no longer the dominant maritime power in the Mediterranean, and it would be centuries before the Greeks or Romans began to demonstrate such prowess. Indeed, from about 1200 BC, the greatest seafaring peoples of the region were the Phoenicians. Originally a loose federation of city-states, Phoenicia was situated on the eastern Mediterranean coast in an area corresponding to modern Lebanon and the coastal plains of Syria. Its key seaport city-states were Tyre and Sidon. Others included Byblos, Akko, and Berytus, the predecessor of modern-day Beirut. As a flourishing center of trade and colonization, the Phoenician maritime empire included nearly every port city of the Mediterranean, as well as up the Atlantic coast to Iberia and beyond. Possessing advanced sailing and navigational skills, Phoenician explorers apparently visited far-flung areas of the known and unknown world, parts of Africa, the Baltic coast and North Sea, the British Isles, even America. 3. Describing Phoenicia, the historian George Rawlinson wrote that for 1,000 years, from the 14th century to the 4th century BC, a great and remarkable nation, separate from all others, with striking and peculiar characteristics, drew upon itself the eyes of the whole civilized world, and played a most important part in history. Egypt, Judea, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome came successively into contact with the country and its settled inhabitants, while almost the whole known world made acquaintance with its hardy mariners who explored almost all seas, visited almost all shores, and linked together the peoples from Spain, Britain, and the Fortunate Islands in the west to India, Taprobane, and the Golden Chersonese in the east in the silken bonds of a mutually advantageous commerce. 4. British historian John C. Gawler has made a career of researching the history of Israel. Quoting the Manual of Ancient History, he writes, "It is known that the Phoenicians preceded the Greeks in forming commercial establishments along the coasts of Asia Minor and the shores of the Black Sea. In the eastern seas they had establishments on the Persian and Arabian Gulfs. The Spanish peninsula, called in scripture Tarshish, was the country with which the Tyrians had the most lucrative trade. And the colonies they established soon became independent states. Colonies were also planted beyond the Straits of Gibraltar. Trade was extended to the British Islands and to the coasts of the North Sea. 6. Of utmost importance, however, was Israel's close relationship with the Phoenician people. Under King David, Israel enjoyed a particularly beneficial association with the Phoenician king of Tyre, Hiram. After David's death, we read that Hiram sent his servants to Solomon, since he had heard that they had anointed him king of his father, for Hiram was always a friend of David. 1 Kings 5 verse 1. Rawlinson notes, with the Hebrews were always on the most friendly terms. 7. Consequently, Solomon invited Hiram to assist in the building of the temple David had planned. Stephen Collins writes, King Solomon and Hiram pooled their natural resources on the temple construction project. In fact, the temple construction project led to intimate cooperation between Israel and the Phoenician city-states as armies of workmen from each country worked in the other's territory. The temple project served as a unifying force to cement the alliance between Israel's tribes and the Phoenician city-states. This extraordinarily close working relationship was greatly facilitated by the two nations sharing linguistic heritage. The Phoenicians were predominantly of Canaanite origin, but their Semitic language was almost identical to Hebrew.
And we see this all throughout scriptures. We see this all throughout scriptures. And we know that this is scriptures. This is where the Freemasons, they get a lot of stuff, Hiram Abiff, a lot of their rituals and everything. They believe that they hold the key to eternal life because Hiram Abiff helped to build the temple. And they were master builders, and the Bible even says that.
With their northern settlement in close proximity to Phoenicia, as well as the fact that they shared a common seafaring interest, the Danites benefited most from this alliance. Gawler notes, the Danites and the men of Tyre were naturally on very intimate terms. It was a very remarkable privilege to be accorded to a foreign nation, to be allowed to help in building Solomon's temple. The Danites and the people of Tyre intermarried. The cunning craftsman especially sent by Hiram to superintend the work of the temple was the son of a man of Tyre, and his mother was of the daughters of Dan. See 2 Chronicles 2 verses 13 to 14.
Let's go back to that. Moreover, the Danites and the people of Tyre intermarried. We know that. We see all throughout scriptures. God even calls the Egyptians his people. And they are 1/3 with the 1/3 of Israel, and I think the other 1/3, I cannot remember. But you know what I'm talking about. The cunning craftsmanship, especially sent by Hiram to superintend the work of the temple, was the son of a man of Tyre, and his mother was the daughters of Dan. It tells you, see the scripture right here.
According to Collins, the Israelite-Phoenician alliance became the world's dominant military power of that time. Israel's military might, combined with the naval and commercial power of the Phoenician city-states, created an alliance that was both militarily and economically superior to the remainder of the world. 10. But Solomon was not content to be a land power alone. He wanted to make Israel a major international maritime force around the world. For this, he turned to the Phoenicians. Over time, even as the Israelite and Phoenician populations were melded on land due to the vast building projects of Solomon, they also coalesced into one unit at sea. 11. In 1 Kings 9 verse 26 we see that King Solomon built a navy of ships. Moreover, the passage describes a joint trade expedition from a Red Sea port of Israelite ships manned by both Israelite and Phoenician sailors. And Hiram sent with his servants, shipmen who had knowledge of the sea with the servants of Solomon. Verse 27. This expedition, which went to Ophir and brought back gold, was the first of many joint maritime trade expeditions between Israel and the Phoenicians. In fact, a fleet of the ships of Tarshish, an Iberian seaport city along the western coast of Spain or Portugal, manned by Phoenician and Israelite sailors, made a worldwide voyage every 3 years, bringing back an assortment of exotic cargo. 2 Chronicles 9 verse 21. Since the Bible records that Phoenicians and Israelites jointly crewed Israelite ships, it is likely that Israelite sailors also served aboard Phoenician ships. Thus, Israelite sailors, who were no doubt primarily Danites, would have quickly acquired the Phoenicians' navigational skills. It appears that Solomon's maritime exploits eventually exceeded that of the Phoenicians, at least in some respects. Gawler, quoting the Jewish Chronicle, writes that in the Golden Age of Glory were indeed the public carriers of their day, travelers for commercial enterprise to all the then known countries near and far. The ships of Solomon rivaled the Phoenician navy. 12. Most historians have overlooked or minimized the implications of Israel's close seafaring relationship with Phoenicia. Clearly, Phoenician ships gave Israelite sailors and explorers access to many far-flung areas of the then-known world. Wherever the Phoenicians went, Israelites almost certainly accompanied them in significant numbers.
This is also part of the reason why you see Phoenicians or Ham's lineage on the slave ships with the Israelites.
Clearly, Phoenician ships gave Israelite sailors and explorers access to many far-flung areas of the then-known world. Wherever the Phoenicians went, Israelites almost certainly accompanied them in significant numbers. But most importantly, the tribe of Dan was inspired to do their own exploring, establishing trade routes and colonizing new lands as they chose. Because of the extraordinary close association between Israel and Phoenicia, Israelite colonization endeavors have frequently been wrongly attributed to the Phoenicians. Gawler contends that historians often confuse Phoenician exploits with those of Danite explorers. But this is a logical mistake, given the close working relationship between the two peoples. He writes that we find Grecian, Irish, Scandinavian, and English histories teeming with notices of a certain race called Danai, or Danans, or Danonii, who are either called Phoenicians, or mentioned in company with Phoenicians. Almost wherever Phoenicians are said to have traded, there we either hear of these Danai, or we find a river or district stamped with the name of Dan according to the early custom recorded of that tribe in the scriptures.
Now, if that's the case, and we can prove that, they proved it, and we can also prove it. is it possible for it to happen in other places? Like, is it possible that the Queen of Skota, who is said to be an Egyptian princess, was she really an Egyptian princess? Remember in our last sermon, we made a point where they said that it was a possibility that Akhenaten wasn't even her father. Is it possible that the story that we are seeing about this Egyptian princess is really, at its core, a biblical Hebrew Israelite story that they took and turned it into what it is today, this Egyptian princess who was married to this pharaoh, and so on and so on and so on and so on? Or are there elements there that are true and we just have to peel it back, allow ourselves to be led by the Spirit to understand? Was she an Egyptian princess? Was she an Egyptian princess because the two were, intertwined with each other back then? And they said, hey, this is a Egyptian princess. She's not a Hebrew. She's not a Hebrew Israelite. Or did she really hide her identity from the beginning? Either way, we still see there's a connection directly back with what? With Ireland, Scotland, the Bible, Hebrew Israelites.
Almost wherever Phoenicians are said to have traded, there we either hear of these Dani, or we find a river or district stamped with the name of Dan according to the early custom recorded of that tribe in the scriptures. 13. Later we will look at numerous examples of how the Danites left their tribal name as way marks on their travels and migrations. Likewise, modern archaeologist and scholar Cyrus Gordon relates that historians often use the term Phoenician in the wider sense of Semitic peoples in general, including the Hebrews.
Facts.
Concerning Israelite colonization exploits, Gordon contends that although such accomplishments are frequently labeled Phoenician or Syrian, the evidence indicates that ancient Israel deserves credit for much of what has been attributed to Phoenicia. Point 14. The Danites' early colonization of Ireland. Just before Moses died, he gave specific prophecies concerning each of the tribes of Israel. Of Dan, he said, Dan is a young lion, springing forth from Bashan, Deuteronomy 33 verse 22, author's translation. The northern city of Dan was actually within the region known as Bashan. With youthful vigor, the Danites were to spring forth from that area, which they did by sea. As we will see, this was by divine providence, for the Danites were used by God to establish advanced Israelite colonies that would, in time, become new homelands for portions of the lost 10 tribes, particularly the birthright tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. It is apparent that Danite explorers were familiar with the British Isles through long-time marine-based trade relationships dating back as early as 1000 BC or earlier. In fact, Britain had long been a Phoenician colony and port of call centuries before the fall of Israel. Of this, Collins writes is well known that the Phoenicians traded throughout the Mediterranean as well as the Atlantic Ocean to western Spain and the 10 mines of the ancient British Isles. Phoenician alliance of Israel, Tyre, and Sidon had established many colonies in North Africa, Spain, other Mediterranean locations, the British Isles, and even as far as North America. 15.
And we know this. They was already traveling over there. When you go look at the historical records, you see people traveling over to what is known as the Americas way back before what most people have been taught. As I mentioned in the other sermon, a lot of the food that Joseph had got, I'm going to say a lot, but enough of it, that Joseph had got, it was coming over from the Americas. It was food that wasn't even native to Africa that he had, that was found over there.
Rawlinson hints at the Israelites' early presence in Britain. The Phoenicians had one more colony towards the west, which has a peculiar interest for all English-speaking peoples. Phoenician ships from Gadara braved the perils of the open ocean, and coasting along the western shores of Spain and Gaul, without, apparently, making settlements, crossed the mouth of the English Channel from Ushant to the Scilly Isles, and conveyed thither a body of colonists who established an emporium. The attraction which drew them was the mineral wealth of the islands and of the neighboring Cornish coast, which may have become known to them through the Gauls of the opposite continent. It is reasonable to suppose that the Phoenicians both worked the mines and smelted the ores. They certainly drew from this quarter those copious supplies of tin and lead which they imported into Greece and Asia, and from which they derived so large a profit. 16. Since Israelite crewmen frequently served aboard Phoenician ships, it is logical that significant numbers of Israelites would have resettled in Phoenician colonies to work. It is likewise plausible that Danite pioneers would have been among the colonists Rawlinson says came to Britain to work the tin and lead mines.
You see that? Danite pioneers would have been among the colonists, quote unquote colonists. This was our own people over here.
According to the origin of our Western heritage, the renowned archaeologist E. Raymond Captain wrote that Irish historians trace part of the tribe of Dan to Ireland as early as about the 12th century BC, during the time judges governed Israel. Moreover, the Irish historian Keating related that the Danann, who had been in Greece, settled in Ireland and Denmark because they did not want to fall into the hands of the Assyrians.
Okay, it said the Danite tribe was in Greece. Is it a possibility that this Pharaoh, could he have been a Danite? Down the way. Now, of course, we see, according to what it's saying, and with the research, it traces back to Elam first and foremost, right? We've seen that, the Scythians and so on and so on and so on, right? But we know they mixed in with other tribes. Tribes of Israel mixed in with other tribes, meaning Judah would have been, somebody from Judah would have got with somebody from Benjamin, or somebody from Dan would have gotten with somebody from Judah or Ephraim or any of the tribes. We know that, which would have led to this guy named having the Elamite lineage, which is still Shemitic, and then whatever lineage he had inherited from whoever, which would still have been Shemitic, but more so that specific lineage of what we call Hebrew Israelite. And remember, we read that scripture last time where the Danite woman, she had a son, and the father of her son was what? Was an Egyptian, yet the child was still considered a Hebrew Israelite. We read that.
Moreover, the Irish historian Keating related that the Danann, who had been in Greece, settled in Ireland and Denmark because they did not want to fall into the hands of the Assyrians. 17. Thus, by the time the house of Israel fell to Assyria, it is probable that large numbers of Israelite settlers were already well established on the coasts of Britain, if not further inland, and parts of Ireland. Rather than assume that indigenous Europeans had been colonizing Britain between 1000 and 600 BC, it is more likely that Israelite immigrants who lived and worked in Iberian colonies eventually moved on and joined their fellow Israelites in the British Isles.
And that's facts, because we're going to prove it, not in this video. Well, maybe we'll prove in this video if we haven't already proven it to you before. But with the evidence I want to specifically show you later on, we're gonna prove that even more, I should say.
J. H. Allen suggests that this was likely the case. Just how long the ships of Palestinian seaports had been replenishing or colonizing the Isles, even before the Assyrian captivity of the 10 tribes, is not known. But historians place the time as early as 900 BC 18. The fact that Danite explorers were from a very early date familiar with the British Isles, and most likely established at least a few colonies among the Isles, would prove vital to Israel's long-term survival after the Assyrian captivity. As a key element in the fulfillment of the Abrahamic promises, these Danite pioneers opened the way for later exilic Israelites to follow to the northwest. Just as significant, however, was the fact that both Iberia and the British Isles received a major influx of Israelites, mostly from Dan and Simeon, just prior to the fall of Samaria. Collins notes that by the time of Samaria's fall in approximately 722 BC, many Israelites had voluntarily migrated out of Palestine in an effort to avoid captivity. He writes, much of the tribe of Dan apparently sailed as far as Hibernia, modern Ireland, in their effort to. Their arrival in considerable force in Hibernia as the Tuatha De Danans is recorded in the early histories of Ireland. Note the similarity between Hibernia and Iberia, which both originate from the Hebrew Eber or Iber. Tuatha De Danans means literally the tribe of Dan.
Now, remember the other story they put forth. They said that these people right here, they were what? They were a race of gods. There was a race of gods, and there was this war amongst them. And they ended up being defeated, which led to who? The King James lineage, and so on and so on and so on and so on. Now, we know our people are known for that, exalting ourselves that way. And I'm not saying that we aren't, because the Bible says that. Christ himself said that. But the key to it is it has to be through Christ. It has to be through Christ. It has to be through Christ. Right? Family fighting amongst family. And remember, Dan had already got in trouble anyway for what he had did. God had already judged Dan. Because Dan felt like the position he was at, he should have been at a higher position. I think it says specifically that Dan would judge the nations. He would judge the tribes. He was supposed to serve in that position, like pretty much like the right hand of Christ. Judah being the head, and then the tribe of Dan being right there. But Dan took it to a point where obviously he wasn't supposed to.
Note the similarity between Hibernia and Iberia, which both originate from the Hebrew Eber or Iber. Tuatha De Danans means literally the tribe of Dan. He adds that large contingents of the Israelite tribes of Dan and Simeon, the Danaan and the Simonii, sought refuge in Ireland and Britain after abandoning their old homelands to the Assyrians. Consequently, many of the succeeding waves of Celtic migrations to Britain were also Israelites in search of a permanent homeland. 19 indeed, for Israelites seeking refuge following the Assyrian captivity, any Phoenician or Israelite colony could have served as a new homeland. It is only logical to conclude that Israelites migrating out of the Middle East would have been well aware of these pre-existing Israelite colonies in the British Isles. A number of scholars note that the arrival of the Tuatha De Danans in Ireland is recorded in the early histories of that land.
Mm-hmm.
Collins contends that, as a maritime tribe, it would have been easy for many Danites to escape the advancing Assyrians by sailing west. Ancient records indicate that the tribe of Dan arrived in Ireland at the time of the fall of Samaria. The Simonii landed in Wales and Southern. Unmistakably recorded in British history that...
Okay, whatever reason I skipped over it. They land in Southern England around the same time. Allen similarly notes it is, and then we continue on.
Unmistakably recorded in British history that the earliest settlers in Wales and southern England were called Simonii. They came by way of the sea in the year 720 BC. At this time there was the greatest influx of the Tuatha De Danann to Ireland, and this synchronizes with the deportation of the Israelites to Assyria and the flight of Dan and Simeon from the seaports and coast country of Palestine. 21. While a sizable contingent of Israelites from the tribes of Dan and Simeon fled by sea to Iberia and the British Isles, those tribes actually taken captive by Assyria later migrated, over hundreds of years, into northwest Europe, and many moved on to the Isles. But how did those Israelites know about Britain, or even know enough to migrate in that particular direction? Could it be that they were aware of certain Israelite colonies in Britain, trade post settlements established at least as far back as the time of Solomon and subsequently greatly reinforced just prior to the fall of Samaria? Dan's waymarks. You will recall that a portion of the tribe of Dan lay in the northern region of Israel. It is certain that these Danites would have been taken captive in the initial Assyrian invasion, which involved the northern areas of Palestine. As a result, these Danites would have been among the Israelites migrating via overland routes out of the Middle East and into Europe, and later on to the Baltic region and the British Isles. Like their brothers who left ahead of them by sea, these Danites would leave a scattering of telltale waymarks bearing the name Dan. These waymarks, almost inestimable in number, provide important evidence of Israel's journey from the Promised Land to their new homes in northwest Europe and the British Isles. Interestingly, in Jacob's final address to the 12 tribes of Israel, dealing with the latter days, he said, Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel.
Facts. That's what I was saying earlier. That's right there. They put it in there.
Dan shall be a serpent by the way, an adder in the path, that bites the horse's heels, so that its rider shall fall backward. Genesis 49 verses 16 to 17. There are two vital aspects to this prophecy, both relating to the Danites' proclivity to name or rename geographical areas according to their tribal name, Dan. Commentaries point out that the serpent motif is apt for the Danites, as it points not only to the tribe's warlike nature but also to their ability to exploit others through craftiness and subtlety, as opposed to sheer strength or numbers. However, serpents also leave a distinctive trail as they move across sandy ground, showing exactly where they have been. Look again at verse 16. It is quite apparent that Dan never judged, or ruled, the other tribes of Israel in the common sense of the term. Those key responsibilities were expressly given to Judah and the Levites. But the Hebrew word used here for judge has other meanings. In fact, we might paraphrase verse 16 thus, as one of the tribes of Israel, Dan shall plead the cause of his people. For this usage, see Proverbs 31 verse 9 and Jeremiah 30 verse 13. In other words, Dan, whose name actually means judge or one who pleads a cause, was to plead the cause of the lost tribes of Israel. How? By using their tribal name, Dan would leave a migratory trail all over Europe, witnessing to the world, particularly in the latter days, Genesis 49 verse 1, that the so-called lost 10 tribes of Israel did in fact survive their Assyrian captivity. Moreover, having found new homelands in areas of northwest Europe and the British Isles, and, subsequently, in America. Dan's waymarks provide living proof that God has kept his promise to Abraham that the patriarch's offspring would become a great company of nations and a single great nation. As pointed out earlier, the tribe of Dan expanded its inheritance by taking the northern city of Laish, renaming it Dan, Judges 18 verse 29. But prior to their arrival at Laish, the Danites established an encampment in Judah which they subsequently named Mahanadan, Camp of Dan, verse 12. Ancient Hebrew had no written vowels, or word's vowel sounds, and, thus, its exact pronunciation were supplied from memory, preserved by tradition and subject to local dialect. Dan, therefore, would be written DN, but pronounced Dan. Over centuries of migration, countless linguistic and cultural influences would often result in other vowels being substituted. Thus, Dan's waymarks include scores of cities, lands, rivers, etc. bearing, in one form or another, the names Dan, Din, Din, Don, and Dun. For example, an early name for southwest England corresponding to modern Cornwall and Devon, where the Phoenician Danite tin mines were located, was Denmoni. The British historian William Camden explains that the name is a composite of monia, which means tin mine, and the name Dan, meaning Dan's tin mines. He notes that the area was inhabited by a group of Britons called the Danmonii or Dunmonii, the name could suggest. Danish miners, point 22 colon.
Now, I noticed that they were a group of Britons, group of British. And this is Collins notes that 2 old Irish forts still bear the name of these early Danite settlers. You see names right here.
As brought out previously, a large body of lost Israelites settled for a time in the area known as Arsareth, west of the Black Sea, modern Bulgaria and Romania. This region was bordered on the south by the Dardanelles and Macedonia, and to the north was split by the Danube River, all three names showing the presence of Danites. The Dardanelles Strait probably initially received its name by maritime Danites exploring the Aegean Sea, and Celtic Israelites no doubt named the Danube centuries later as they used it to migrate further into Europe. While the Saxons bore the name of Isaac, the Danes bore the name of the tribe of Dan, which had apparently attached its name to the major rivers entering the Black Sea when the region was dominated by Celts, Cimmerians, and Scythians. Thus, we have the Don, Donets, Danube, Dniester, formerly Dnastris, and Dnieper, formerly Dnapris. In the mountains of Switzerland is the river Rhone, formerly the Rhoden. As well, the Po River, running from the Alps, was once called the Aridon. The port city of Dunkirk in northern France may well have been a Danite maritime trading post. The island country off the coast of Italy, Sardinia, was doubtless so named by seafaring Danites, as was Cyprus, which was at one time called Iad Nan, the island of Dan 24. Various ancient maps label the North Sea as Danicarum Mare or Sea of the tribe of Dan. Similar maps mark the modern state of Denmark as Danos.
What it's telling us is that God used the tribe of Dan to go to these different places and put waymarks on all these places for Israel. Let that sink in. Which we know is a fulfillment of Bible prophecy because we end up going to these different nations, staying there for a little bit. We ultimately all ended up in captivity, being sent to the four corners of the world. A nation, a people that was supposed to go to different nations and establish the ways of God, we end up falling from grace, going to different nations, and being in captivity.
Various ancient maps label the North Sea as Danicarum Mare or Sea of the tribe of Dan. Similar maps mark the modern state of Denmark as Danos. Denmark, whose inhabitants even today refer to themselves as Danes, is derived from Danemark, meaning Dan's mark. To their north is Sweden, also bearing Dan's name. In fact, all of the region known as Scandinavia bears Dan's waymark, Scandinavia .25. Throughout Ireland there are scores of places bearing Dan's name: Danslew, Dansower, Dundalk, Dundrum, Donegal Bay, and City, Dunlow, Dungarvan, Londonderry, and Dunsmore, which means more dawn. Not only is there a River Don north of the Black Sea, there is a Don River in both England and Scotland. In England there is Doncaster, Dundee, Dunkirk, Dunbar, Dunraven, and scores more of Don, Dons, Dins, and Duns. Of course, there is the capital of England, London, and the capital of Scotland, Edinburgh. The Latin name for northern Britain is Caledonia, the area today associated with the Scottish Highlands. 26. Gawler has aptly noted, the tribe of Dan by its enterprise and vigor has made itself one of the most conspicuous branches of Jacob's family. 27 Indeed, as the pioneer of his nation, Dan has well pled the cause of lost Israel by providing an unmistakable trail of waymarks that demonstrate a clear migratory path from the Mideast to the British Isles, proof positive that the peoples of the Isles, and, thus, America, are of Hebrew origin.
Very, very
The
interesting.
Danites' pre-Exodus migrations. There is one additional aspect of Dan's travels, one of profound importance. As will be brought out in a later chapter, the ruling line of King David was never to end, and his throne was to exercise rule throughout all generations until the Messiah, son of David, should come and assume that throne. Luke 1 verse 32. But as the southern kingdom of Judah was going into captivity to the Babylonians, it seemed that David's line and his throne was about to end with the demise of Judah's last king, Zedekiah. What was needed was a way to reestablish David's throne via someone of Solomon's royal dynasty in another location where a Davidic descendant could legitimately continue to rule over some portion of Israel. But where? It is clear that Danite explorers established colonies in Ireland as early as Solomon's time, or even a bit earlier. Some of these colonies would in time become home to certain royal members of the line of Judah who would sit as monarchs over the Israelite settlements. As we will see, God used the prophet Jeremiah to reestablish the royal line of David in Ireland to be coupled with the area's already established Judaic royalty.
And this is why I told you before, the lineage of King James traces back to Hebrew Israelites. Are we seeing what's going on? And then once that fell, because they want to do wickedly, now you have even more Bible prophecy being fulfilled. Our people coming in droves to the Americas and being enslaved on this plantation, when the seed of America is from Great Britain, which is where a lot of our ancestors ruled. We went from sitting on the thrones and ruling to being on a plantation that we are supposed to be ruling over. That's established from our people. Crazy how far we've fallen.
As we will see, thus, the throne of David would be restored, actually ruling over a part of Israel. This amazing turn of events was made possible, in part, because of Dan's extraordinary zeal to explore and settle new lands by sea. As explained fully in chapter 12, after Joseph's passing in Egypt, there eventually arose a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph, Exodus 1 verse 8. What is implied by this passage is that animosity and conflict gradually developed between Egypt and Israel. The result, ultimately, was slavery for the children of Israel. But before the conflict reached that critical point, some of the Jewish ruling nobility, those of Judah's Zerahite line, abandoned Egypt aboard ships, most likely Danite. Sailing directly northwest across the Mediterranean Sea to what would become Greece, they established several notable cities, Argos, Athens, Miletus, etc. They spread inland as well, settling areas such as Macedonia, which retains Dan's name.
Okay, let's read it one more time. They're saying that it was mostly Danites that got out of there before it got real bad. And it says sailing directly northwest across the Mediterranean Sea to what will become Greece. If we're going with this, then that means that a lot of the Danites would have been what we call ancient Greece. Grecians, how you say it? This king of Greece that they mentioned before, that married this Egyptian princess, Egyptian queen. Could this king of Greece, and they said he was king of Greece, he was the king of he came from Babylon. Like he just came from all over, right? Maybe he came from all over because he was traveling all over. Is it a possibility that he was a Danite? Is it a possibility that he was a Danite? His Hebrew Israelite side would be the Danite side, and then the other side would be the Elam side, the Elamite side, tracing back to the Scythians, and them tracing back to the lineage of Elam, which is still Shem.
Sailing directly northwest across the Mediterranean Sea to what would become Greece, they established several notable cities, Argos, Athens, Miletus, etc. They spread inland as well, settling areas such as Macedonia, which retains Dan's name. Centuries later, during Solomon's golden reign, Danite explorers began colonizing Ireland. Soon thereafter, Israelites from Greece known as the Tuatha De Danann, the tribe of Dan, also began visiting Ireland, bringing Zerahite nobles by way of Miletus. In time, these Milesian Jews, traveling aboard Danite ships, became established as a ruling class over the developing Israelite colonies.
Okay, there you go. In time, these Milesian Jews, Milesian, how you say it? Milesian Jews? Traveling aboard Danite ships. Let's go back. Soon thereafter, Israelites from Greece, known as the tribe of Dan, also began visiting Ireland, bringing Zahirite nobles by way of Miletus, how you say it. In time, these Milesian Jews traveling aboard Danite ships became established as a ruling class over the developing Israelite colonies. They're ruling over their own people, which is it always causes infighting. And that was because of what David did, King David, right? We read about them right here tracing back to who they called this Pharaoh. And they're connected to Akhenaten, and he's connected to Moses, with the guy is connected directly to Moses because Moses is said to have healed him when he was bitten by a snake. And we see that in scriptures, that exact event happening. Now, did the early Scottish, Irish people try to make a direct connection with the Bible so they can establish a history for it? They say, okay, we're going to take this. We're going to use this for our own. Is that the case, or is this real history? Or is the Scottish, Irish history actually Bible histories, which is why they used it? That's what I believe. I believe the evidence is overwhelming for that. It wasn't something that they were like, okay, we're going to take this and then apply it. It wasn't no thing like the Khazars with what they did. We're going to take this history and apply it to us like it's ours. Because we're doing this, we're doing that. These people that came over there, they didn't have to do that. So we're seeing that the Milesians, they are Jews. They're Jews. They are Hebrews. They are Hebrews.
Ultimately, it was to these Jewish nobles in Ireland that the prophet Jeremiah came, seeking to join the royal line of David in a period of extended exile from Palestine to a long-established ruling line of the tribe of Judah. Thus, the pioneering tribe of Dan played a key role in the preservation of the throne of David. Chapter 9 notes. 1.
Okay, so it's the notes they got. And it says, as noted in chapter 8, Iberia was the name of an ancient Israelite Phoenician colony in Spain. Hence the Iberian Peninsula. We're going to touch on that later. You're going to see that connection. Some of you already know about it. Centuries later, the Caucasus region between the Caspian and Black Seas came to be known as Iberia, confirming it as an area of Israelite resettlement. Iberia, Iber's land, or land of the Hebrews, come from the word Hebrew itself, Ibri, which stems from Eber, progenitor of Abraham. According to Jory Brooks, numerous ancient maps mark the Caucasus region as Iberia, an alternate spelling of Iberia in Hebrew translation. The B and the V are frequently interchanged. And then it gives you the sources for that. Use some more sources. All right. Now let's go to our next point. I think we'll go to chapter 9? We're going to go to chapter 10. Yeah. Chapter 10, Celtic Saxo, Israel moves into Northwest Europe and the British Isles.
Historically, numerous clans and tribes of diverse peoples converged on Europe over a period of several centuries. Those groups finally settling in Northwest Europe and the British Isles appear both to be related and to have largely shared a common culture. However, what is not widely understood is the homogeneous origin of such peoples, that they were, in fact, Israelite. But can we actually trace the migrations of the lost tribes of Israel to Northwest Europe and the British Isles? If historians have found no mention of the exiled tribes of Israel in ancient records, it is simply because the Assyrians and other peoples did not call them by their original ancestral names.
You see what I'm saying? Was the princess, was that her real name, or was it just a name that they put on her? Or was it a story they knew about and said, okay, we're going to take this and apply it to our own, the way that we want it to be done? We know this happens all the time. We have to figure that out. But what we have figured out is what? We have figured out who these people really are. We have figured out that we've been lied to. Once the great nation of Ireland, Scotland, Great Britain, they were combined, they started to fall. A lot of them got out of there. We know when stuff gets bad, we migrate amongst our own people. We came down to the Caribbeans. From the Caribbeans came up to the Americas, and the rest is history.
If historians have found, as we have already seen, Israel was recognized in captivity, and for over a century thereafter, as primarily Sumerians and Scythians.
Didn't we read about them earlier? They're telling you that Israel in captivity, that the Assyrians and all these other people, they call them the Sumerians and the Scythians. That's what they called them. They weren't calling them by their native name. And again, we have been able to trace Persians, Iranians, all the way back to who? To Elam. And of course, we know there was mixing amongst the tribes and so on throughout this time period. And then a branches off and they say, okay, we're going to call ourselves this or whatever. We know that. We do that amongst our own people right now.
Thus, it should come as no surprise that the tribes of Israel were subsequently identified in Europe by still later names given to them by the nations among which they sojourned. As this chapter will bring out.
Let me add a point to that, just to prove it to you. African American. Even though we know who we really are, we still call ourselves African American. We still call ourselves black, even though black isn't a race. The black man, the white, we know nobody walking around, I would say that no white person is walking around this white. If you saw this, if a white person saw a person this white of their own kind, they would be like, nah, I don't know what's wrong with them. African American would be a perfect example of that. That's not a name that we gave ourselves. They gave it to us. But we still roll with it because we understand what it means. Even though we know that we are Hebrew Israelites. Thank you, Holy Spirit.
As this chapter will bring out, the Sumerian Israelites became known largely as Celts as they moved further to the west. Similarly, the Scythians became known primarily as Saxons as they too migrated to the northwest.
All right, let me pause it right there because I got to bring this up. I got to. I'm going to forget. I got to. I got to. I know there are people that don't believe this stuff. Let's go look at your man that you believe. You don't want to believe this. Okay, let's go look at your man, Benjamin Franklin. Observations concerning the increase of mankind, 1751. This is like a landmark. You all wonder why I come back to it? Because it's a landmark. You go somewhere, you say, okay, I know that I'm at a certain point because you got the landmark. Let's say you leave the city that you're from and you come back. you know there are certain landmarks there that are just they're gonna be there, right? So for us, this is a landmark right here. This is a landmark. You already know where we're going. You already know where we're going. Let me close this. Which leads me to add one remark, that the number of purely white people in the world is proportionally very small. Now, this is 1751. When America was just being established. I should say the current America was just being established. All Africa is black or tawny. Asia chiefly tawny. America exclusive of the newcomers being his body of white people, wholly so. So America minus these newcomers, the small group of white people, it was what? Tawny or black. And then Europe, we saw that. We've been reading about that. The Spaniards, we read about them. Italians, French, Russians, Swedes, Sweden, all these different areas, what are generally of what we call a swarthy complexion, as are the Germans also. But there you go. The Saxons only accepted who with the English make the principal body of white people on the face of the earth. The Saxons only accepted who with the English, now he's talking about their Saxons. I'm not talking about the original Saxons. He's talking about their Saxons. Because remember, they're not the ones that originally started the 13 colonies. The 13 colonies were already there. They had their version of the Saxons. Like we're Saxons from this area. But we're talking about the original Saxons. This is what we're talking about. The Scythians became known primarily as Saxons as they too migrated to the northwest. Now, we tie that together. If Benjamin Franklin is talking about that, okay, we're the Saxons, and then they're tracing the Saxons back to the Scythians, and the Scythians are tracing back to who they said Japheth, that would make sense. That would make sense because they're laying hold to it under the assumption of this right here. But we know the Scythians trace their lineage all the way back to Elam. Therefore, that man could not have been from the lineage of Magog. He was from Elam's lineage, which is a Shemitic lineage. We don't know who I don't know who his parents was, but we know that there was a connection with Elam, that lineage of where the Scythians come from, and the Israelite lineage, specifically, and those two coming together because they was all in the same area and end up in the same area.
This, of course, is a broad generalization, as other names were also assigned to migrating groups of Israelites: Gauls, Goths, Galatians, Scandinavians, Angles, Jutes, etc. Moreover, there was clearly a certain level of integration between some of these groups.
You're telling me in history they saying that they had Israelites? And he tells you, the perfect point what I was making, this of course is a broad generalization. They branched off, okay, we're going to be this, we're going to be that, this is what we're going to call ourselves. You had Israelites that were going by the name of Galatians. Maybe they didn't want to be known as Israelites, but they knew who they were. This is why most of Israel is going to hell. Hiding under these names, hiding under these different names, so they can worship these false gods. And we know they was doing that in Ireland and Scotland. We know that for a fact.
Another reason researchers have been unable to locate the so-called lost tribes of Israel in history is that they wrongly assumed that the tribes could only exist, if at all, as small, isolated groups characterized by their observance of Jewish-like customs. But as indicated by the Abrahamic promises we have examined, the birthright nations of Israel were to grow into wealthy, powerful, well-populated nations. In fact, the birthright nations of Ephraim and Manasseh would become the most powerful and influential nations in all of history. But they would in no way be Jewish. As Hosea 1 verse 10 brings out, God would greatly multiply lost Israel so that their population could not be measured. Indeed, the Jewish historian Josephus verifies that the tribes had, by the 1st century AD, grown into a multitude not to be estimated by numbers. One by Jesus' day, the tribes of Israel had already begun migrating again, leaving areas around the Black Sea and moving further to the northwest. When Jesus spoke about the lost sheep of the house of Israel, he was speaking of lands outside of Palestine where the 10 tribes had become lost from view while migrating through other nations. But clearly, they did exist and their whereabouts were known.
Yep, and we know this for a fact. Not only because they were lost because let's say lost from view. They were lost spiritually. We know that. They were lost spiritually, going to these different nations and thinking they're going to get away and worshiping these false gods. In the book of Acts, we see all these Jews from these different nations coming to Jerusalem. Say that one more time. In the book of Acts, we see all these Jews from these different nations coming to Jerusalem to worship, hearing the word of God in their native tongue, hearing the works of God in their native tongue that they knew. Just like I wasn't born in Africa. I wasn't born in Scotland or Ireland. My ancestors were, but I wasn't. Therefore, if somebody from Africa with a language that I don't know comes over, let's say I go over there, I'm like, man, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know what you're talking about. But if I'm from America and I'm say going to the promised land, I'm going to Israel, and I hear the works of God in my native tongue, which would be English, it's going to get my attention. I'm like, whoa, what's going on here? Whoa, 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 whoa. I know about the history of where my people have been, where they come from, but I'm from America. I was born in America. You see what I'm saying?
It is readily acknowledged by historians that the Celtic and Anglo-Saxon peoples in particular provided the racial stock from which several modern Western nations have developed, including Great Britain and the United States.
Uh-oh.
As Yair Davide notes, the Scyths, Goths, and Sumerians and related groups of Scythia were all one people from one original stock, which was Israelite.
This is what he's saying. He's saying that the same people we've been mentioning, they were all one people from one original stock. They come from the same place. Now, they would have started out, specifically the Scythian, they would have started out Shemitic from the lineage of Elam, right? But with these being all the same people, we know what happened. We know what happened, which makes them Israelites. We know you got Israelites up in here. Specifically, I'm being specific. You got Hebrews, you got Hebrew Israelites. You got Hebrews, you got Hebrew Israelites. Because we know Hebrew comes from Eber, and you have Hebrew Israelites, Israelite being from that specific family branch of who? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob's whose name was changed to Israel. That's why I keep saying that, so you can understand it, so you can make the connection. So you would have Scythian, Elamite lineage marrying with a what? A Israelite, and giving birth to some of these people, and so on and so on and so on and so on. And the perfect example, we saw it with who? With Esther. We saw it with Queen Esther.
As Yair, from these nations emerged those of Northwest Europe. Two accordingly established.
Go back, because they skipped over that. They skip over when it's like these little brackets or whatnot. I got it like that because they had some other stuff going on. But I want to make sure I read it. From these nations emerged those of Northwest Europe, and thus the British Isles and America. And America. Most of your early Americans came from Great Britain, Scotland, Ireland, over to the Americas. Until, we hit the bottom of the bottom. As God promised that we would.
2. Accordingly, establishing the identity of the ancient Celtic Saxon peoples is the key to connecting the lost tribes of Israel to the nations destined to inherit the birthright blessings promised to Abraham. Israelite cultural developments. By the late 6th century and on through the 5th century BC, the areas of Arsareth and Scythia were well populated with Sumerians and Sakasithians. It was here, along the shores of the Black Sea and in the South Russian steppes, that the Israelites' culture rapidly developed as a part of the European Middle Iron Age. Point 3. Historians and archaeologists note that from roughly the 500s BC, the region of Europe north of the Mediterranean shared two related cultures. First, spreading westward from southeast Europe along the Danube River basin existed what historians label the Hallstatt and Latine cultures. These names are based on important archaeological finds discovered at Hallstatt and Latine, Austria. The finds are considered textbook examples of Central European Celtic culture, which is generally defined by such discoveries. The Hallstatt culture developed first, c. 600 to 450 BC, setting the stage for the later Latine culture, c. 450 to 50 BC. As the evidence indicates, Celtic culture as a whole originated with the Sumerians who settled these areas of Europe as they moved west along the Danube from the Black Sea region. Further east was a second, related culture, that of the Scythians. Occupying a vast area of Eastern Europe and the Russian steppes, the Sakasithians
What it was at? It was all up in Russia. What it? Hold on now. I know I'm a little bit slow sometimes, but hold on now. What did Benjamin Franklin say way back in 1751? And in Europe, the Spaniards, Italians, French, Russians, Russians and Swedes are generally of what we call a swarthy complexion. Huh? Okay, that makes sense. They was all up in Russia.
Further east, while each culture adapted to the geography of its own region, the Scythian and Celtic clans interacted like peoples sharing a common ancestry, freely conducting trade, intermarrying, and exchanging cultural ideas.
There you go. And guess what? I haven't even read this. We're reading this together. We are reading, listening. We are doing it together. I was speaking, being led by the Spirit. It's not too hard to figure out that they were intermarrying, though. When you have the wisdom of God, we know that. Come on now. It's no great mystery.
Archaeologically, the two groups were almost identical, particularly in the area of burial rites, see below. As the Encyclopedia Iranica states, the Sumerians cannot be differentiated archaeologically from the Scythians. For back in Palestine, the tribes of Israel each exhibited distinct cultural differences within the greater culture of the kingdom. These distinctions, having survived the Assyrian captivity and subsequent migrations, help explain the cultural differences between the Celts and the Scythians as a whole, as well as the cultural variations between the clans making up these groups. Point 5. Davide notes these two related cultures, after being expelled from the Middle East, the Scyths, Sumerians, and Goths split into several bodies of which two main groups may be roughly identified.
Facts.
One group went west at an early date and became associated with the Cimbrians, Galatians, Celts, Geti, and Daci of Europe. Remaining in Scythia longer, the second group became the Jutes, Saxons, Angles, Franks, Scandinavians, Goths as well as others. Point 6. The Hallstatt and Latine archaeological finds are central in defining the heartland or origin of the Celtic peoples. Essentially, this heartland appears as a broad swath across Central Europe, bordering the western edge of the Sumerian Arsareth. 7. When properly interpreted, these finds help establish the fact that the Celtic peoples were actually of Sumerian origin. As will be shown, history reveals a definite link between the Sumerians and the Celts. 8. By about the middle of the 6th century BC, steady Sumerian growth and Scythian migration into areas west of the Black Sea caused a significant number of Sumerians to begin moving further to the west, leaving Arsareth. Following the agriculturally rich Danube River basin, these pioneering Sumerians eventually emerged in Central Europe as a peoples the Greeks called Keltoi, Celts. This period represents the Celtic Hallstatt culture, approximately 600 to 450 BC. Due to growing migratory pressure, the Celts greatly expanded their sphere of influence from the 5th century to the 1st century BC to become the dominant cultural force throughout Central and parts of Southern Europe, the Latine period. Britannica states, the oldest archaeological evidence of the Celts comes from Hallstatt, Austria. By the mid-5th century BC, the Latine culture, with its distinctive art style of abstract geometric designs and stylized bird and animal forms, had begun to emerge among the Celts centered the Middle Rhine. 9. Some Celtic Israelites did migrate as far as the northwestern shores of Europe and beyond, but the Baltic areas became primarily the domain of their Scythian, Anglo-Saxon brothers. Celtic expansion in Europe. By about 450 BC, most of the Sumerian Israelites had moved up the Danube and settled as Celts in Central Europe. Their Latine culture would gradually evolve over the next few centuries. But due to migratory pressure, the Celts would again find themselves being pushed further to the west, and even to the south. Barbaric tribes invading from the Far East pushed the Scythian Israelites westward, which in turn put pressure on the Celtic Israelites. In fact, two Asiatic groups began to aggressively invade Scythia from the east, first the Sarmatians, from about 300 BC, then the Huns, beginning around 200 BC. Noted archaeologist E. Raymond Captain writes, like a domino effect, as Sarmatian pressure forced the Scythians toward the west, the Sumerians were forced into the more remote regions of Europe where they became known as the Celts and Gauls. 10. Over time, these forced migrations would take the Celts into parts of northwestern Europe, even as far as the coastal areas of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, and southward into northern Italy and the Iberian Peninsula, what is today Spain and Portugal. The center of Celtic expansion was Gaul, which lay north of the Alps in the region now within the borders of France and Belgium and part of Spain. The earliest Celts who were major players in the classical world were the Gauls, who controlled an area extending from France to Switzerland.
Switzerland?
It was the Gauls who sacked Rome and later invaded Greece. It was also the Gauls migrated to Asia Minor to found their own, independent culture there, that of the Galatians. 11. The area known historically as Gaul is generally inclusive of modern France, Belgium, Switzerland, Holland, northwest Germany, and northern Italy. Many writers define Gaul proper as lands extending from the Rhine and the Alps westward to the Atlantic. A considerable number.
So according to what they are saying, they're saying the land of Galatia would more so be named after these Israelites that named it this.
A considerable number of Celts later migrated further westward into Britain and Ireland. By the later Latine period, this Celtic culture had expanded over a wide range of regions, whether by diffusion or migration, to the British Isles, Insular Celts, France and the Low Countries, Gauls, much of Central Europe, the Iberian Peninsula, Celtiberians, Celtici and Galaici, northern Italy, Gauls, and as far east as Central Anatolia, Galatians. 12. The Galatians, to whom the Apostle Paul addressed his New Testament epistle by the same name, were essentially an eastern branch of the Celts. Concerning their connection to ancient Israel, Davide writes, according to conventional history, the British Isles, Gaul, France and Belgium, and the northwest European coastline in ancient times were settled by peoples of Celtic culture. A predominant element among the Celts were the Galatians ascribed Sumerian origin by classical writers. The Sumerians had first appeared on the fringes of the Assyrian Empire shortly after the majority of northern Israelites had been exiled. 13. Des Thomas notes that in addition to settling the Low Countries of France, Belgium, Holland, and northwest Germany, the Celts also settled the Jutland Peninsula, primarily the mainland of Denmark. Importantly, the area was once called the Chersonesus Cimbrica, the peninsula of the Cimbri. Cimbri is a key name for the Celts, as it links them back to the Sumerians. Numerous historians and early writers held that the Cimbri and the Sumerians were the same peoples. Quoting the Greek philosopher Plutarch, 46 to 120 AD, Thomas writes, "They were called at first Sumerians and then, not inappropriately, Cimbri." The philosopher Posidonius, 130 to 50 BC, also wrote that the Cimbri originated on the shores of the Black Sea, where they had been known to the Greeks as the Sumerians. As the Sumerians moved to the northwest, they became known to the Greeks as Celts, but to the Romans as Gauls. It appears that by about the 1st century BC, the general term Celt was used collectively for the Sumerians, Cimbri, Cimmeri, Kimri, the Gauls, the Belgi, and other Israelite clans. Point 14.
For those who are listening, he's not saying S-U-M-E-R-I-A-N-S. That's what our Sumerian. He's saying Cimmerians. It's, for those who are listening, I know some of you are listening like the Sumerian. I thought those were Sozo people. He's Simmerians. For those who are listening and not looking at the screen.
The 1911 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica notes that the Cimbri universally held to be Celts, and that ancient writers spoke of all these Gauls as Cimbri and identified them with the Sumerians of earlier date. 15. The same encyclopedia, in its article on the Cimmeri, asserts that later writers, Strabo, Pliny, Plutarch, identified with the Cimbri of Jutland, who were probably Teutonic Celts. 16. Historically, the Teutons were known to have inhabited Jutland, Denmark, in the 4th to 2nd centuries BC. Apparently, the Teutons, Cimbri, and Celts are all the same peoples, Sumerian Israelites. It is apparent that the term Cimbri finds its roots in the ancient Assyrian name given to the Israelites, Cymri. In his book Early Celtic Britain, scholar John Rees writes that the Celtic Cymri were for some time indifferently called Cambria or Cumbria, the Welsh word on which based. Moreover, he notes that Cymri, or Cymri, a name the Welsh commonly go by, is even today pronounced nearly as an Englishman would treat it if spelled Cymri or Cymri. 17. As we have seen proven from ancient artifacts of the Middle East, Cymri or Cymri was the Assyrian name for the house of Omri, Israel, and was particularly associated with the Gimri or Sumerians. 18. Indeed, the similar spelling and almost identical pronunciation of the Israelite Assyrian Cymri and the Celtic Cymri, Cimbri, can be no coincidence, and this connection between the ancient Hebrews and the Cimbri Celts is too strong to be ignored. The Celts move into the British Isles. Throughout the development of the Latine cultural period, the Celt-Scythian brothers were also moving westward, pushed on by the invading Sarmatians and Huns. The primary region to which they migrated was the northwest reaches of Europe, Scandinavia, and the Baltic areas. According to Davide, many Celtic clans also found their way to the Baltic region, where they joined the Anglo-Saxon invaders of England. 19. But long before the Saxons began to show an interest in Britain, the Celts were already moving across the English Channel. As one researcher puts it, when pressed by the Sags, the Sumerians divided into two groups, one group into Western Europe by way of the Danube Basin, the other into Asia Minor. The Western Sumerians were identified with the first race of the Cymri, and came into Britain. They occupied northern France under the name Belgi and invaded the British Isles as the Brythons. 20. According to the website Lost Dash, the period of Celtic dominance in Europe began to unravel in the 1st centuries AD with the expansion of Rome. The influx of an Asian immigrant population, the Huns. By the time Rome fell, the Celts had been pushed west and north to England, Wales, and Ireland, and later to Scotland. 21. Similarly, the Encyclopedia Britannica notes, the Celts moved westwards. The British Isles, Brythons, and the Goidels. The Brythons crossed the...
Let me go back. It says, similarly, the Celts moved westward, eventually reaching the British Isles, and went by the names Brythons and Goidels. Remember we saw that person earlier? Yeah, buddy.
The Britons crossed the Channel and established themselves in England and Wales, but the Goidels, probably in the 4th century BC, passed directly to Ireland. 22. The name Brithin, an early form of Britain, is discussed in detail below. Quoting largely from research conducted by the renowned English physician Adam Rutherford, the webbook The Origin of Our Western Heritage summarizes the movement of the Sumerian Celtic Israelites from the Balkans to the British Isles. The Sumeri or Kimri came into Britain from the area of the Black Sea after traveling toward the northwest, through the Low Countries, then across the North Sea. The Celts who filtered into Britain from Gaul appear to have come from the area of the Danube. The Celts and Belgae who settled in Britain were Nordic, and their skulls scarcely differ from those of the Anglo-Saxons who followed. The book contends that pre-Christian civilizations found in northern Gaul, Britain, and Ireland originated with Sumerians from the Ukraine, Black Sea area, and that such Celtic settlements began to be established in Britain as early as around 300 BC and continued for centuries. 23. Thus, just as Sumerian Israelites from the western region of the Black Sea moved across Europe in stages to become the Celts, so the Celts moved in stages across the English Channel to settle the British Isles. Stephen Collins writes that Israelite immigrants furnished much of the racial stock of early Celtic Britain, and that waves of Celtic immigrants arrived in Britain over several centuries. 24. As brought out in the previous chapter, large groups of the Israelite tribes of Dan and Simeon, known historically as the Danaan and the Simonii, had sought refuge in Ireland and Britain centuries earlier after abandoning their homelands in Palestine to the Assyrians. Collins writes that many of the succeeding waves of Celtic migrations to Britain were also Israelites in search of a permanent homeland, that they were intent on following the paths their kinsmen had followed centuries earlier. 25.
All right, so you had Dan, you had Simeon over there. You had the other tribes over there. Come on now. You know they were going to be fighting. You know they were going to be intermarrying. And that's what we see in history.
Scythian clans pushed to the extreme northwest. Because of its mostly arid climate, the Russian steppes had become the desired location for numerous dispossessed peoples of Central Asia, including the dominant Saka-Scythians of Israelite origin. But according to researchers, Sarmatian and subsequent Hunnish advances caused the Scythians to fragment into smaller subclans as they were pushed out of Scythia toward the northwest.
That makes sense.
Edmund Filmer, for example, writes, at first the Scythians dominated the whole of the steppe country between the Carpathians and the Sea of Azov. During the 4th century, however, the Sarmatians began to move westwards from the Don as far as the bend in the Dnieper. The Sarmatians subsequently advanced from the Dnieper to the Carpathians during the last 2 centuries before the Christian era, and finally into Hungary. The Scythians became divided. 26. The Encyclopedia Americana notes, the Scythians are those tribes that occupied territory from about 700 BC and formed a single cohesive political entity until the 4th century BC, when the nation was splintered into several groups by aggressive Sarmatian migration. 27. Consequently, distinct Scythian bands migrated in numerous waves over several centuries into extreme northwest Europe. Reflecting this forced migration, the Greek historian and geographer Strabo, about 63 BC to 23 AD, wrote that the Scythians resettled in lands toward the north, near the ocean, that is, in the Baltic region, north of the encroaching Sarmatians. Pliny, the Roman scholar, mentions that the Scythians had settled on islands in the northern ocean off the coast of Europe, an obvious reference to the Scandinavian region. 28. Thus, from approximately 50 BC, those Celtic Israelites who had earlier settled in the lower Baltic areas of Europe began to be overrun by Scythian newcomers such as the Saxons, Danes, Vandals, Goths, Angles, Jutes, and Franks, all of which shared a common heritage not only among themselves, but also with their Celtic brothers.
That's what we were saying.
29 earlier. Significant areas of the British Isles had by this time been settled by peoples of Celtic origin. But many of their Scythian kinsmen, who were rapidly moving to the west, would soon be looking as well to the Isles for a permanent homeland. According to David's extensive research, Hunnish aggression beginning around 160 BC, as well as extreme climate changes in key areas of the steppes, forced the Scythians into northwestern Europe, from which they attempted to re-establish themselves in Scandinavia. At this very same time, Scandinavia received an influx of population. This Scandinavian repopulation would continue in full force for at least 200 years, paralleling the struggle taking place in Scythia against Eastern invaders. The evacuation of Scythia in stages, and was not always in one direction, though the overwhelming tendency was westward. The incursions into Scandinavia too great to enable stabilized settlement. Thus, there was an almost immediate continuation westward into the British Isles 30. While Scandinavia became a permanent homeland for many of the Scythian peoples, it was an area of transit for others on their way further west. Interestingly, Scandinavian tradition traces its ancestry to the Don River region, exactly where Scythians had long been settled. Davide notes that the region originally was named Scandinavia or Skatenage in honor of invading royal Scyths. Echoing other researchers, he writes that the name Scandinavia probably was originally intended to denote the land of the Scyths. 31 Likewise, the online Wikipedia says the name means island of the Scythian people. 32 Indeed, archaeologists have recovered numerous cultural items from Scandinavian lands that clearly originated along the northern coast of the Black Sea. The Scythians' earlier home. 33 Davide concludes that Scandinavian mythology, art styles, and religion all recall their Scythian origin. 34. Archaeological evidence of westward movement. Scattered throughout southern Russia and parts of Europe are burial sites clearly identified as Scythian in origin. Archaeologists have determined that the sites show a Scythian presence in these areas spanning several centuries. The geographical distribution of these burial sites is most revealing. As we will see, the earliest such sites are found in southern Russia and the Crimean region, with subsequent sites scattered throughout the Ukraine. Even later sites have been located in Central and Northwestern Europe. This pattern demonstrates an unmistakable Scythian migration to the northwest. In this part of Eurasia, the dead had long been cremated, the ashes being buried in an urn. Over time, inhumation, bodily burial, became widespread. Moreover, it became increasingly popular to include in the grave some of the deceased person's most valued belongings. Filmer notes that over time an increasing number of chieftains' tombs began to be utilized. The striking feature of such burial sites was that the body was buried in a wooden chamber along with silver and gold ornaments, as well as various weapons. This configuration was unmistakably Scythian, as they were known for their timber tombs in which were placed a high quantity of quality weapons and personal ornaments. Archaeologists are certain that these wooden tombs are evidence of the establishment of Scythians throughout the region. 35. According to the online Wikipedia, the Sumerian and Scythian societies were characterized by an advanced timber grave culture in which elaborate royal kurgans typically contained weapons, Scythian-style wild animal art, gold, silk, and even chariots, as vehicle burials were also a distinctive trademark of the Scythian culture. 36 Collins adds that royal Scythian graves often featured horses buried along with the deceased. 37.
And where do you think they got that from? Where do you think they got that from? From my time in ancient Egypt.
Filmer writes, the earliest tombs in Russia, such as that at Kolarmis on the northern slopes of the Caucasus and the Litui Barrow, contained weapons and other articles decorated with gold that show a close connection not only with the earliest Scythian designs, but also with Assyrian, Median, and Eurasian art. This suggests a broad range of influences, just as we might expect of the Israelites who had been subject to these same peoples.
Exactly.
Filmer adds that the earliest Scythian tombs in Russia have been dated to about 580 BC. 38. With similar dating, the Encyclopedia Iranica states, it is in central Georgia that archaeologists have found the greatest concentration of materials of the Scythian type, the earliest dating from about 700 BC. 39 comparable Sumerian tombs in Crimea, dating from 650 to 600 BC, help to confirm this. 40 In fact, according to Thomas, thousands of tombstones have been found in Crimean graveyards bearing Hebrew inscriptions. 41 These are clearly Sumerian or Scythian in origin.
Makes you wonder what's really going on over there in the land of Ukraine.
Filmer writes, the earliest tombs in Russia, such as that at Kolarmis on the northern slopes of the Caucasus and the Litui Barrow, contained weapons and other articles decorated with gold that show a close connection not only with the earliest Scythian designs, but also with Assyrian, Median, and Eurasian art. This suggests a broad range of influences, just as we might expect of the Israelites who had been subject to these same peoples. Filmer adds that the earliest Scythian tombs in Russia have been dated to about 580 BC. 38 With similar dating, the Encyclopedia Iranica states, it is in central Georgia that archaeologists have found the greatest concentration of materials of the Scythian type, the earliest dating from about 700 BC. 39 comparable Sumerian tombs in Crimea, dating from 650 to 600 BC, help to confirm this. 40 In fact, according to Thomas, thousands of tombstones have been found in Crimean graveyards bearing Hebrew inscriptions. 41 These are clearly Sumerian or Scythian in origin. By the early part of the 6th century BC, pioneering Scythians had gotten as far west as the Carpathian Mountains. Reflecting subsequent waves of migration, Scythian graves dating from the 4th century have been found on both sides of the Dnieper River as far north as Kiev, northern Ukraine. Even areas of Hungary and southern Poland feature numerous Scythian burial sites. Still later sites, however, have been found in upper northwest Europe. Filmer writes, a significant fact, noted by Polish, Scandinavian, and even German scholars, is that the chieftains' graves in South Poland are at least a century older than the earliest ones on the Baltic coast, the early centuries of the Christian era. These burial rites spread north into the Danish islands and Jutland Peninsula. Prior to 100 BC, the lands bordering the southern Baltic Sea, now Poland and the former East Germany, had been rather sparsely populated, but from that date onwards, cemeteries increased in number with the introduction of new burial rites. Filmer concludes that the chronological distribution pattern of Scythian burial sites indicates a migration from south to north. 42. Davide's research has led to a similar conclusion, that such burial site patterns show a definite, gradual Scythian migration from Scythia into Scandinavia and the Baltic area. He writes that wooden chamber graves found in southern Poland from before 200 BC suggest the presence of Scythian settlements and indicate a movement of the Scythians to the north and west. He adds, after 100 BC the same type of grave is evident on the North Baltic coast, and still later the same royal Scyth grave reappears in Jutland, Denmark, where it continued in use for several centuries. 43. Anglo-Saxons dominate Baltic region, British Isles. Although Scythian and Celtic clan designations cannot be correlated to the original Israelite tribal names, their number and variety suggest the migrating Israelites attempted to preserve at least some of their distinctions along tribal lines. The renowned British historian Sharon Turner wrote, the different tribes of the Scythians, like those of the Cimmerians and Gauls, had their peculiar distinctive denominations. 44 Scythian bands migrating into northwest Europe included the Saxons, Danes, Vandals, Goths, Angles, Jutes, Alans, Lombards, Franks, etc. Many of these settled in or moved through Scandinavia and the Baltic region. Of great importance were the Saxons and Angles. The Saxons were a powerful Scythian clan in northwest Europe. According to
this is what I'm telling you, the Saxons, these are the original Saxons. Right here. Because you go over here, he says, the Saxons only accepted, who with the English make the principal body of white people on the face of the earth.
Of great importance were the Saxons and Angles. The Saxons were a powerful Scythian clan in northwest Europe. According to research by Rutherford, the geographer Ptolemy, 2nd century AD, referred to the Sakai as Saxons, and the historian Albinus, late 700s AD, said the Saxons were descended from the ancient Sakai from Asia. 45. As we saw in chapter 7, Saxons literally means sons of Isaac. Recall that God had told Abraham, "In Isaac shall your seed be named," Genesis 21 verse 12, RSV, and others. Turner writes, the Saxons were a German or Teutonic, that is, a Gothic or Scythian, tribe, and of the various Scythian nations which have been recorded, the Sakai, or Sakai, are the people from whom the descent of the Saxons may be inferred. Sakaisuna, or the sons of the Sakai. Abbreviated into Saxon, which is the same sound as Saxon, seems a reasonable etymology of the word Saxon,
Which means what? Sons of Isaac, the Saxons. Going back. So he's saying the sons of Isaac only accepted, who with the English make the principal body of white people on the face of the earth. Again, he's not talking about these Saxons that we are talking about. He's talking about his Saxons. His Saxons. Just like you have the synagogue of Satan. They call themselves the synagogue of God. But we know who they really are, right?
Abbreviated into Saxon, which is the same sound. Ptolemy also informs us that the Saxons had settled on the neck of the Cimbric Peninsula, or Jutland, Denmark, which had previously been occupied by Celts. Yet history records little of the Saxons until the end of the 3rd century AD, when they were described as pirates infesting the coasts of Gaul and branded as enemies of Rome. 47. In fact, the nations that overthrew the Roman Empire came from Central Asia. This mass of people included the Goths, Vandals, Angles, and Saxons. 48. According to Collins, the Saxons and other Scythian tribes jointly migrated into Europe from Asia. While the Saxons bore the name of Isaac, the Danes bore the name of the Israelite tribe of Dan. 49. By this time, however, the Romans had developed the practice of referring to Scythian tribes in general as Germanic, meaning they were genuine Scythians as opposed to Sarmatian transplants. 50.
Okay, that's an interesting point. It said that the Romans, they refer to the Scythian tribes in general. Oh, they're Germanic, they're German. And the meaning of that was what? That they were genuine Scythians as opposed to these people during this time period. Now we jump back over here. And in Europe, the Spaniards, Italians, French, Russians, and Swedes are generally what we call as swarthy complexion, as are the Germans also.
Allied with the Angles, the Anglican peoples, the Saxons came to eventually dominate parts of England and Scotland. Davidier writes, from the Saka were to emerge the Anglo-Saxon invaders of Britain. Large formations of Saxons began arriving in northwest Europe between 200 to 300 AD. The Angles, together with the Saxons, Sakai, and Jutes, Latiae, from Scythia were to be the dominant elements in the conquest of England. From Jutland emerged many of the invaders of England. 51. From about 250 AD, Gothic bands, allied with their Celtic kinsmen, began harassing the western parts of the Roman Empire, while Anglo-Saxon pirates, approaching from Scandinavia, began intermittently attacking the coasts of Britain. However, the Anglo-Saxon invasions of Britain would not commence for another 200 years due to resistance by Roman occupiers. Collins writes, Saxons from the eastern shores of the North Sea ravaged the coasts of Britain and occasionally penetrated deep into the lowland zone. Until the end of the 4th century, the empire was strong enough to repair the damage done by the incursions. However, Rome's hold on Britain soon deteriorated, forcing them to abandon the Isles altogether. Ultimately, the native British Celts invited Saxons from the European mainland to assist them as mercenaries, but the Saxons eventually occupied much of England, pushing the native Celts into Wales and Scotland. 52. In his book The Story of Celto-Saxon Israel, the late British historian and scholar W. H. Bennett writes that the Romans invaded and occupied part of the country, but this was a military occupation. few Romans settled in Britain, and all of the military forces were withdrawn about 410 AD. The next permanent settlers to come into Britain were the Saxons, who began to arrive from northwest Germany and southern Denmark and Scandinavia about the year 450 AD.
I remember it's the same family.
They were divided into a number of tribes, one of which, the Angles, gave us the names England and English 53. Who were the Angles? Many authorities contend that the Angles took their name from their ancestral home in Jutland, Ungol, modern Angel, which features an area shaped geographically like a hook. Ungol is Old English for fishhook. But according to Collins, Angle or Engel is likely based on the Hebrew word for bull, egel, pronounced igel. Pt4 Anciently, the bullock was an identifying sign of the tribe of Ephraim, Deuteronomy 33 verse 17. This suggests the Angli, as the Romans called them, were a dominant part of the birthright tribe of Ephraim. At any rate, it is obvious that the name England, from the Old English Engleland or Engleland, originated with the Angles. By most accounts, the Anglo-Saxon era covers early medieval England from the end of Roman rule and the establishment of numerous Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in the 5th century until the Norman conquest in 1066. Throughout the 600s AD, Scythian newcomers from the east continued migrating into Scandinavia. The resultant overpopulation led to the Viking overseas expeditions of the late 700s. 55 migrating through Scandinavia, the Vikings included Danes, Norwegians, and other Scythian Scandinavian clans.
Have y'all ever studied the Vikings? The Vikings are not what you see in the movies or historically. They are not what you've been told. And this is telling you it right here.
As explorers, merchants, and pirates, the Vikings raided and colonized wide areas of northwest Europe and the North Atlantic islands from the 8th century. This period of Viking expansion, known as the Viking Age, forms a major part of the history of Scandinavia, Great Britain, and Ireland. The Danes came about 850 AD, and the Norwegians a little later, settling in the northern and western coasts of Scotland. The Normans were the last of the Germanic types to enter England. Thus, the entire history of northwest Europe and the British Isles from the 4th century BC to at least the 800s AD revolved around these Scythian Israelite clans migrating in stages in a northwesterly direction from their areas of settlement around the Black Sea and in Central Asia. Linguistic evidence. Overall, the languages now prevailing in Europe show that there were 3 distinct and successive waves of peoples who entered Europe from Asia. The oldest ones are found in Western Europe. The first was the Sumerians, followed by the Scythians, and finally the Sarmatians, Slavs.
Now remember. Do y'all remember? We found out that these pretty much is from the same family. Remember I did a video called what? The Black Slavs. And I showed you overwhelming evidence that the Slavs, they say, oh, it came from the word slaves. I'm like, okay, but that don't make 100% sense. Now I dug deep and I showed you that the Slav, the people known as the Slavics, they were and are, just scattered other places, Israelites. I may put that at the beginning of the next video because we're gonna read this chapter, we're gonna finish the chapter out, and then we're gonna close it out, and then I get started on I think that was part 5. There's maybe like 10 parts, I don't know, but I'm gonna show y'all that regardless.
The first was the Sumerians, followed by the Scythians, and finally the Sarmatians, Slavs. These 3 stocks make up the source of the native populations in Europe today. The Sumerian group is represented by the Celtic languages, Welsh, Scottish Gaelic, Irish Gaelic, Cornish, Manx, and Breton. The Scythian source is represented by English, Franco-German, Middle Gothic, Old Icelandic, Modern German, Swabian, Swiss, Dutch, Swedish, Danish, Norwegian, Orkneyan. and Lowland Scotch. The Slavic group, stemming from the Sarmatian invasion of Europe, is represented by modern Slavonic as it appears in Russia, the Ukraine, Bulgaria, Poland, etc. 56. This latter group has no connection to the tribes of Israel.
So they're saying that this latter group that came in, they had no connection, which would have been a completely, according to them, a completely different group that was invading. If they have no connection with the tribes of Israel, this group they're talking about, then who were they? Are these your Gentiles that also took on the name of being Slavic? Because you go over here and you type in Slavic people, you go to images. This is not black people. This is not what we call black people, right? Therefore, if this group right here, they're talking about this latter group that has no connection with the tribes of Israel, that would be these people right here. But we can go back in history, we can see a group of Slavs, a group of Slavic people that are said to have been black. This is a perfect example of you can have two groups of people with the same name. Just like you have two groups of people with the name Hebrew Israelites or Hebrews, or however you want to put it, you get my point. You got one group claiming to be from the direct descendants from the tribe of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or lineage of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Then you got another group. Same thing here. You have these Slavs. Then you have the ancient Slavs. You have today's Arabs, and you have the ancient Arabs. And the ancient Arabs, they trace their lineage back to Ham. Yet most people don't know that. The original Arabs called themselves Hamites. That's who they trace their lineage back to. And I showed you that in some previous videos. That's why you have to understand this stuff. So when they bring stuff up like this, you're not confused. Like, oh, the Slavic, this is white folks. Anybody can take on a name or a identity. People do it all the time for different reasons.
What is most interesting are the numerous commonalities between the Hebrew of ancient Israel and the languages spoken in the British Isles. Indeed, the first people to settle the Isles spoke Hebrew, a fact demonstrated by ancient Hebrew inscriptions found in many places in Britain and Ireland.
Did they tell y'all that?
Moreover, Rutherford confirmed that the early literature of Britain was largely a modified form of Hebrew. 57 After all, as brought out in Chapter 9, Israelites from the tribe of Dan actually settled in Ireland prior to the fall of Samaria. Remarkably, the Welsh language today strongly resembles Hebrew. According to Rutherford, it is difficult to find a single article or form of construction in Hebrew grammar that cannot also be found in Welsh. Many sentences of the two languages have very similar wording, and almost every page of the Welsh translation of the Old Testament contains Hebraisms in the sense and spirit of the original language.
This is what I was telling you about the English language. The English language is coming from the language that we speak. That's why when you look up the meaning of words in English, you can always trace them back to other languages. The ancestor languages, you can trace it back. You can take a word in English and trace it back to what we would call the ancestral languages and see it has pretty much the same meaning. Now there may be variation, but overall it's the same meaning. Just like my name in English is Kelson. Yet if I take it back to other languages, it's still saying the same thing. There may be variations of it where it says this or says that, but it's saying the same thing in regards to the character of who I am and who God made me to be. This is why this stuff intrigues me so much, because God put it in me within my name. And y'all know the history and story of that.
According to Bennett, the early Saxon language included hundreds of Medo-Persian words, indicating that the Scythian ancestors of the Saxons had indeed resided, as captives, in Media for some time before migrating through the Caucasus Mountains into Europe. 59.
Oh, but no, the Caucasus Mountains is Caucasus Mountain because you had the Caucasians. I mean, y'all need to study. But it even tells you, it says, The early Saxon language included hundreds of Medo-Persian words, indicating that the Scythian ancestors of the Saxons had indeed resided as captives. And we know it just wasn't captives. We know that they was amongst each other. Why? Because Esther married a Persian. And Cyrus the Great was a Persian who traced their lineage back to who? First and foremost, we're talking about the root of it. The Persians traced their lineage back to who? To Elam, a son of Shem.
In the interest of providing linguistic evidence, it is worth repeating the origin of the term Iberia. As previously brought out, portions of the lost tribes of Israel migrated to the north from the areas of their initial exile, settling for a time in the region north of Armenia and the Caucasus Mountains, approximately modern Georgia.
But y'all see,
They subsequently...
I gotta pause right there. See, oh my God. Oh, Caucasus Mountains, Caucasian. Like that was the only place they could be, the only place, because it's Caucasian and Caucasus Mountains, those are the only people that was there in the areas, what we call white folks.
They subsequently named this area Iberia. Collins writes that this region between the Black and Caspian Seas came to be known as Iberia, confirming the presence of Hebrews from the 10 tribes in that region.
Hebrews all the way in the Caucasus Mountains.
Seagoing explorers from the tribe of Dan had long before given the same name to an old Phoenician Israelite colony in Spain, hence the Iberian Peninsula. Collins adds, the appearance of the same Hebrew name, Iberia, in the region north of Armenia verifies that this region became an area of Israelite resettlement. 60 Iberia is clearly of Hebrew origin, being derived from the word Eber, meaning one from beyond, or an outsider. Eber was the ancestral patriarch of Abraham. The word Hebrew itself is from the related term, Ibri. Davide says Iberia means land of the Hebrews. 61 Rees notes that Ireland was once known as Iberian. 62. But the most striking linguistic
Iberian, Ireland, Iberian, land of the Hebrews. Iber, I-R-E, Hebrew land, meaning they went there and this is where we at.
But the most striking linguistic connection between ancient Israel and those who ultimately settled the British Isles concerns the Hebrew word for covenant. If the Celtic and Anglo-Saxon peoples of the British Isles are indeed descendants of ancient Israel, it would be most appropriate that they bear in their very name some indication of their covenant relationship to the God of Israel. In Hebrew, the word for covenant is beriath. In Judges 8 verse 33 and 9:4, we see that the word can also be used as a proper name, here coupled with the name Baal, a false god. It is thus rendered Baal-berith, meaning Lord of the Covenant. Since vowels were not written in ancient Hebrew, the literal spelling of beriath would be brth. Its anglicized form preserves the Y sound by adding an I, thus, brith. However, since the Hebrews did not pronounce the H sound, as many Jews today do not, beriath would be, in its anglicized form, pronounced Brit. 63.
The Brits.
Collins notes that the early Celts...
Hold on. The Brits. The Brits. The Brits. The Brits are coming. The Brits. Is that what they said? Did they say the Brits are coming? What they said? I don't know, but you get my point. The British. The Hebrews. In Hebrew, the word for covenant is the people of the covenant. This is why did I close it? I think I closed it. This is why these folk that are sitting on our thrones, they acting like that they are the people of the covenant. I know the blasphemy of those that say they are Jews, but they are not. Either we are lying or they are lying. Which one? Make your mind up and stick with it.
Collins notes that the early Celts described themselves as Brythonic, a reference to their being the covenant people of God.
Whew.
He writes, The fact that these Brythonic Celts who migrated to the British Isles bore the Hebrew BRT root word for covenant confirms their Israelite origin. It is significant that large masses of Celtic people still bore in their name the Hebrew word for covenant, the BRT or BRTH root word of Britain and Brythonic, even after the fall of Samaria.
This is what I was telling y'all about the name. Ooh, Lord. God is good, ain't he? Y'all be wondering where I be getting this stuff from. I sit here and I read these so-called boring books. They don't be boring to me. This is how I get the good stuff. They don't be boring to me. I told you about the names, didn't I? They would change the names, but they would keep the original meaning of it.
J. H. Allen writes, people of Wales call themselves, in ancient Welsh, Brythy, Brethren or Briths of Britain, which means the Covenanters of the land of the covenant. The first form of this phrase is almost vernacular Hebrew. 65 Collins notes that the name Britain originated centuries before the fall of Israel, as the area had long been a Phoenician colony and port of call back during Solomon's reign. 66 The name Britain, covenant land, was obviously given to the region as a reflection of these Israelites' renewed regard for their covenant relationship with God.
Now, let me make sure I say this. I don't know who wrote this book. It's a book that it was actually a website that I came across and they had it. And I skimmed through it and the Holy Spirit would lead me like, use this. Because they have some points in here. I'm like, okay, I'll use those points. I'm like, well, I just have to go back because they were making points, but you had to go to the other chapters to get the point. That's why we're doing it like this. They probably don't know who the true Israelites of the flesh is. They're probably speaking this stuff from the perspective of the people that are, sitting on the throne right now in Britain. Prince Charles III and all of them. And the rest of them that are over these monarchies around the world. And the people over in the land. That's what this is probably referring to. But we know the truth. All they did was do all the research for us to make our job even easier. And that was by God himself doing that. We're going to have them do all the work. And then we're going to take it and say, y'all talking about us. And we can prove it. They spending all their money on this. We just spend a few dollars. And a lot of it we get for free. You got to pay for your internet or whatever if you buy a book, but you get the point.
Moreover, the Hebrew word for man is Aish or Ish. In English, the Ish ending, which is said to be Germanic or Scythian in origin, means of, belonging to, or relating to a specific peoples or thing.
And that's what we saw in, in the Bible. It mentioned the woman as an Israelitish woman. It was saying that because the boy's father was a Egyptian. It was making that distinction that, specifically, hey, this is who she is. So therefore, the boy still had claim to who he was as a Israelite, even though his father was an Egyptian. But they tell you, oh, no. Yet they don't believe the Bible because we showed you.
Moreover, the Hebrew word for man is Aish or Ish. In English, the Ish ending, which is said to be Germanic or Scythian in origin, means of, belonging to, or relating to a specific peoples or thing. When we join these two Hebrew words, we have British or British covenant man.
And the people that are over in the land, Jewish, what are they saying? Oh, we belong to the Jews. I believe they're not really saying that they're Jews. It's a play on words. Most of them know they're not. I believe it's a play on words. Because why? I'm going to close it out. I'm going to save my thoughts for the next video. I believe it's a play on words because most of the ones that are in power, they know. They're not really saying they're Jews. They're saying that we No, we belong to y'all. What we got from the Khazars, we got from y'all. But they're trying to present it as if they are the people. Why? Because most people don't know any better.
Indeed, the British, along with their Irish, Welsh, and Scottish kin, and their American brothers, are the modern-day people of the covenant, the modern-day descendants of lost Israel who were destined to inherit the Abrahamic birthright blessings promised to Ephraim and Manasseh.
And that would be us here in the Americas, because, most of us listening right now, we in the Americas. Most of us, I know not all of us, but most of us talking about us now here in the Americas, right? So, these are the notes. We're not going to go through that, but we're going to pick it up in part 5. I'm going to bring up that video about the Black Slavs. We're going to make some points with that. And then we'll go to chapter 11, chapter 12, and then to, probably part 6. And then we'll go from there. With that being said, God bless each and every one of you. In Jesus Christ's name, as always, stay focused for Jesus. And as you know, the truth is not debated, it is declared.